The island was already old when the pyramids of Egypt were being planned. It sits in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, a rocky limestone plateau rising from the water south of Sicily, its surface marked by the ruins of temples that were built before writing had reached the western Mediterranean, before the great civilizations of Greece and Rome had found their form, before almost every structure that European history remembers as ancient had yet been imagined. The island is called Malta, and the temples that stand on it and on its smaller neighbor Gozo are among the oldest known freestanding stone structures. The oldest of them was under construction around 3600 BCE. That is approximately 500 years before the first stones of the Great Pyramid were laid at Giza. It is 1,000 years before Stonehenge took its final form. The people who built these temples were farming communities on a small island in the central Mediterranean, without metal tools, without writing, without wheeled vehicles, and without any of the organizational technologies that we usually associate with monumental construction. What they had was stone, time, and a tradition of building that lasted for roughly 1,000 years before it stopped, as suddenly and as completely as it had begun. The temples of Malta are not widely known outside the field of prehistoric archaeology. They appear in specialized publications and in the itineraries of travelers who make the specific effort to seek them out, but they have not achieved the popular recognition of Stonehenge or the pyramids or the great monuments of the classical world. This relative obscurity is partly a matter of geography and partly a matter of the broader cultural narrative about where civilization began and which places matter in the story of human achievement. Malta sits at the edge of that narrative, and its temples have been waiting at that edge for 5,000 years. Tonight we go to Malta. We walk through the temples. We sit with the mystery of a tradition that lasted 1,000 years and then vanished, leaving its stone buildings standing on a Mediterranean island as evidence of something that deserves to be much better known than it is. The temples of Malta were built, used, and abandoned before the Bronze Age had fully arrived in the central Mediterranean. By the time the Minoan civilization of Crete was flowering, by the time the first cities of the Greek world were being established, the temple tradition on Malta was already history. The structures that modern visitors walk through are therefore not simply old. They are old in a way that places them in a different world from almost every other monument that receives regular public attention, a world before literacy, before bronze, before almost everything that we think of as the foundation of Western civilization. We look at the carved stones, the decorated facades, the altars and the niches and the underground chambers. And we ask who built these structures, why they built them here, and why a tradition of extraordinary architectural ambition began and ended on a small island in the middle of the sea. Malta challenges the standard account of where monumental architecture begins and who was capable of producing it. The standard account places the origins of monumental construction in the great river valleys of the ancient Near East and in the Nile Valley of Egypt, in the contexts where large populations, agricultural surplus, and centralized political authority came together to organize the labor required for building at scale. On this account, the great monuments of the ancient world are the products of complex civilizations, of states with the administrative capacity to direct large workforces and the ideological frameworks to motivate their sustained effort over long periods of time. The Maltese temple builders do not fit this account. They were not a state. There is no evidence of the kind of centralized political authority that the standard model considers necessary for monumental construction. The island of Malta in the Neolithic period supported a relatively small population, perhaps a few thousand people at most, living in farming communities whose material culture is consistent with a modest level of social complexity. And yet these communities built structures of a scale and a technical sophistication that would challenge many later and apparently more complex societies. The largest of the Maltese temples, the Gantija complex on the island of Gozo, has outer walls still standing to a height of 6 meters, built from limestone blocks, some of which weigh more than 50 tons. The planning and execution of these structures, which involve multiple interconnected chambers arranged in a distinctive clover-leaf plan, with carefully fitted stone surfaces, decorated facades, and evidence of sophisticated acoustic and light management, speaks to a tradition of architectural knowledge that was accumulated and refined across many generations. The question this raises is not simply about Malta. It is about what we assume when we think about who was capable of what in the prehistoric world, about the way the standard narrative of human social development shapes what we expect to find and what we are prepared to recognize when we find it. The specific scale of the Maltese community makes the achievement more striking, not less. A large, complex civilization building monumental structures is noteworthy, but it is not surprising in the way that the Maltese case is surprising. What the Maltese evidence shows is that the capacity for a specific kind of organized, technically sophisticated, symbolically rich architectural achievement was present in a small farming community on an island in the central Mediterranean 5,000 years ago. That is a different kind of evidence, and it requires a different kind of explanation. It is about the relationship between social complexity and architectural achievement more broadly. If a farming community of a few thousand people on a small island could build structures of this kind without the institutional apparatus of a state, then the standard model of what monumental construction requires needs to be reconsidered. The temples of Malta are evidence that the capacity for organized, ambitious, technically sophisticated construction was more widely distributed in the prehistoric world than the dominant narrative has tended to assume. The landscape of Malta is unlike any other in the Mediterranean. The island is a low limestone plateau, roughly 27 kilometers long and 14 kilometers wide, with no rivers and no permanent freshwater sources apart from the rain that falls during the wet winter months. The rock that forms the island is a pale yellowish limestone called coralline limestone, hard and dense, and beneath it a softer layer called globigerina limestone, easier to work but less durable when exposed to the elements. The distinction between these two rock types was important to the Maltese temple builders, who used the harder coralline limestone for exterior walls and load-bearing elements and the softer globigerina for interior surfaces and decorative work. The landscape today is dry, rocky, and windswept, with terraced fields cut from the thin soil that covers the limestone bedrock. In the Neolithic period, the island may have been somewhat more wooded, with small trees and shrubs providing a modest forest cover on the better-watered northern slopes. But Malta was never a heavily forested island, and the timber resources available to the temple builders were limited. The stone that forms the island was their primary building material, and they used it with a skill and a confidence that speaks to long familiarity with its properties. The sea is always visible from Malta. No part of the island is more than a few kilometers from the coast, and the sound of the sea is audible from most of the major temple sites on quiet days. The relationship between the island community and the sea that surrounded it was not one of separation but of orientation. The sea was the medium through which contact with the wider world occurred, the source of the fish and the marine products that supplemented the agricultural diet, and the barrier that gave the island its distinctive identity as a place apart from the mainland world. And the horizon is the horizon of the Mediterranean rather than the horizon of a continental landscape. The people who built the temples lived in this coastal, maritime environment, and the sea was part of their daily experience in ways that would have shaped their understanding of the world and their place within it. The isolation of the island, surrounded by water on all sides, may have been part of what made the Maltese Neolithic tradition so distinctive and so persistent. A community separated from the mainland by a sea crossing of nearly 100 kilometers in every direction, developing its own specific traditions over many generations without the constant pressure of external influence that mainland communities faced. The Grand Harbor of Malta, widely regarded as one of the finest natural harbors in the Mediterranean region, provided a sheltered anchorage that would have made the island accessible to maritime travelers even in antiquity, and the presence of obsidian from the island of Pantelleria in the Maltese Neolithic assemblages confirms that the temple builders were in contact with the wider Mediterranean world, even if the specific nature of those contacts is not fully recoverable from the available Evidence. The discovery of the Maltese temples by European scholarship unfolded gradually over several centuries, and the understanding of their significance has been transformed multiple times as new methods of analysis have been applied. The temples were never entirely lost to memory. The farming communities of Malta had lived among the ruins for centuries, and local tradition preserved some awareness that the structures were ancient, though the specific identity of their builders and the nature of their purpose were matters of speculation rather than knowledge. The great stones of Giza on Gozo were attributed in local folklore to a race of giants, the Giganti, and the name Giza, which means Giant's Tower in Maltese, preserves this traditional interpretation. The systematic study of the temples began in the 19th century, when European archaeologists working in the Mediterranean started to recognize the significance of the Maltese structures within the broader context of prehistoric monument building. Early excavations at several sites, conducted with methods that by modern standards were extremely destructive, removed large quantities of material from the temples and recovered artifacts, skeletal remains, and architectural details that established the basic framework for understanding the sites. The work of the Maltese antiquarian Giovanni Francesco Abella in the 17th century and the more systematic investigations of the 19th and early 20th centuries laid the groundwork for the modern understanding of the sites, though they also caused significant and irreversible damage to the archaeological record. The most significant single discovery in the history of Maltese prehistoric archaeology was the excavation of the Hal Ceflini hypogeum in 1902. The hypogeum had been cut from the rock by human hands, its chambers shaped with the same architectural logic that governed the above-ground temples, but translated into the medium of the underground and given the specific qualities of an enclosed, subterranean space. The hypogeum is an underground complex cut into the bedrock beneath a residential area of modern Valletta, and its discovery, during construction work, revealed a multi-level subterranean structure of extraordinary elaborateness, its walls and ceilings carved with the same architectural forms, fake doors, niches, and corbelled chambers, that appear in the above-ground temples. The hypogeum had been used as a collective burial site, and the remains of several thousand individuals were found within it, along with a remarkable collection of artifacts that included the famous sleeping lady figurine, one of the most discussed objects in prehistoric Mediterranean archaeology. Modern archaeological investigation of the Maltese temples, using radiocarbon dating, environmental analysis, and detailed architectural survey, has produced a much more precise and more nuanced understanding of the sites than earlier work could achieve. The chronological sequence of the temples, the relationships between different sites, and the specific social and ritual practices associated with the temple tradition are all areas where recent research has significantly advanced the understanding of this extraordinary pre-Columbian phenomenon. The architecture of the Maltese temples follows a distinctive plan that appears, with variations, at every site on both islands. The basic form is the trefoil or cloverleaf plan, in which two or more pairs of semicircular apses open off a central corridor that runs from the entrance at the front of the structure to a terminal apse at the back. The number of apses varies from 2 pairs to 3 pairs, and the specific proportions and the arrangement of the internal spaces differ from temple to temple, but the underlying planning logic, the sequence of entry, corridor, and flanking chambers, is consistent across the tradition. This consistency, maintained across a period of roughly 1,000 years and across both islands, speaks to a strong and specific architectural tradition, one that was not merely replicated but was understood deeply enough to be adapted and elaborated while preserving its essential form. The walls of the temples are built using a technique sometimes called orthostatic construction, in which large upright stones, called orthostats, are set on their long edges to form the lower courses of the wall, with smaller stones used to fill the upper sections. The orthostats of some temples are among the largest single stones used in any Neolithic structure in the world, and their placement in the wall, their surfaces sometimes decorated with carved designs, required both the physical capacity to move and set them and the architectural knowledge to ensure that the wall they formed would be stable over time. The external facade of each temple was typically built from coralline limestone, the harder and more durable of the two rock types available on the island, and its surface was sometimes decorated with carved designs or with the application of red ochre pigment. The entrance to the temple was through a monumental doorway, sometimes flanked by carved threshold stones, and the transition from the exterior to the interior of the structure was marked by a series of architectural thresholds that created a sense of progressive deepening as the visitor moved from the public space of the forecourt into the more private spaces of the apses. The interior surfaces of the temples, carved from the softer Globigerina limestone, preserve evidence of elaborate decoration that has been partially damaged by the weathering and the erosion of millennia. Carved spirals, pitted surfaces, and abstract designs appear on altar stones, on wall faces, and on the surfaces of architectural elements throughout the temples, and the concentration and elaborateness of this decoration varies across the different spaces of each structure in ways that suggest a spatial hierarchy within the temple, a distinction between more and less sacred zones that was expressed through the density and quality of the decorative program. The relationship between the spatial zones of the temple and the social zones of the community that used it is one of the more productive interpretive questions in Maltese prehistoric research. If different groups within the community had access to different parts of the temple, then the spatial hierarchy of the interior would have reflected and reinforced the social hierarchy of the exterior, making the temple a physical map of the social order as well as a ritual space for activities connected to the community's religious life. The movement of people through the Maltese temples was shaped by the architectural sequence of entry, corridor, and apse in ways that suggest a deliberate management of the ritual and sensory experience of the visitor. The forecourt in front of the main entrance was the most public space associated with each temple complex, and the evidence for fires, feasting, and communal activity in these areas suggests that the forecourt served as the setting for collective ceremonies that involved large numbers of participants. The monumental facade of the temple, visible from the forecourt and designed to present a specific architectural image to those gathered before it, created a visual relationship between the inside of the structure and the community assembled outside it that was clearly deliberate. Moving through the entrance into the first pair of apses brought the visitor into a different kind of space. Enclosed, lower-ceilinged, decorated on its walls and floors, lit by the light that penetrated from the entrance. The apses on either side of the central corridor were distinct spaces that could be entered individually, and the specific contents of each apse, the altars, the niches, the decorated surfaces, would have oriented the attention and the activity of those within it in specific directions. The acoustic environment of the enclosed apse was very different from the open forecourt. Sounds were contained and amplified in ways that would have given ritual activities conducted within the apse a specific sonic quality absent from the exterior spaces. The inner apses, further from the entrance and deeper within the temple, were generally smaller and more intimate than the outer ones, and their contents, where preserved, suggest more restricted and perhaps more specialized ritual activities than those of the outer chambers. Whether these inner spaces were accessible to all members of the community or only to specific ritual practitioners is a question that the archaeological evidence does not clearly answer, but the architectural logic of progressively smaller and more enclosed spaces as the visitor moves deeper into the structure is consistent with a spatial hierarchy in which proximity to the innermost chamber was a marker of special status or special ritual role. The acoustic properties of the temples have been studied in recent years by researchers working at the intersection of archaeology and the science of sound. The conclusions of this research are contested in some of their details, but the basic finding, that the enclosed stone chambers of the Maltese temples produce distinctive acoustic effects that would have been perceptible to people performing ritual activities within them, is broadly accepted. By researchers interested in the role of sound in ancient ritual contexts. The chambers of the Maltese temples, with their curved stone walls and their specific dimensions, produce distinctive acoustic effects, including strong resonance at specific frequencies, that would have made the sound of drumming, chanting, or other vocal or instrumental performance within them qualitatively different from sound produced in the open air. Whether the builders were aware of and deliberately exploited these acoustic properties is uncertain, but the consistent architectural form of the temples suggests that the sensory environment of the interior was considered as carefully as the visual environment. The daily life of the Maltese temple builders was shaped by the specific conditions of island existence in the central Mediterranean during the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. The economy was agricultural, based on the cultivation of wheat, barley, and legumes in the thin soils of the limestone plateau. The specific demands of this agricultural system, the clearing of land, the maintenance of soil fertility on a small island with limited resources, the management of water in a landscape with no rivers or permanent freshwater sources, shaped the daily experience of the community in ways that the physical evidence of the sites reflects. In the thin soils of the Maltese limestone plateau, supplemented by the herding of sheep, goats, and cattle, the fishing of the surrounding Mediterranean waters provided additional protein, and the evidence from the faunal assemblages at Maltese Neolithic sites confirms that marine resources were a significant part of the diet. The combination of small-scale agriculture, animal herding, and fishing is consistent with a productive, if modest, subsistence economy that could have supported the population of several thousand people that most estimates suggest for Neolithic Malta. The material culture of the temple builders, recovered from excavations at the temples and at the associated settlement sites, includes a range of ceramic forms, ground stone tools, small figurines, and personal ornaments that speak to a community with specific aesthetic traditions and specific symbolic preoccupations. The Maltese Neolithic ceramic sequence, which has been worked out in considerable detail through the study of pottery found in stratified contexts, shows a tradition that evolved over the course of the temple period in ways that allow individual phases of the sequence to be identified by their pottery styles. The figurines recovered from Maltese Neolithic contexts are among the most discussed objects in prehistoric Mediterranean archaeology. They include representations of human forms of varying sizes, some very small and apparently portable, others large and fixed within the architectural context of the temple. The most famous are the figures sometimes described as fat-bodied, their forms exaggerating the roundness of the torso and the thighs in ways that have been interpreted as representations of a specific body type considered sacred or auspicious, or as representations of sleep, or as images of ancestors, or as expressions of a symbolic vocabulary whose specific meaning has not been recovered. The social organization of the temple-building community is a matter of considerable debate. The scale of the temples implies organized collective labor, but the absence of clear evidence for a ruling elite, for marked social stratification, or for the kind of centralized authority that later complex societies used to organize large construction projects raises the same questions about Maltese Neolithic society that the Cahokia evidence raises about Mississippian society. How did a relatively small community organize and sustain a construction program of this ambition without the institutional apparatus that the standard models of large-scale collective action consider necessary? The carved decoration of the Maltese temples is one of the most distinctive and most discussed aspects of the tradition, and it provides important evidence for the symbolic world of the temple builders. The spiral is the most prevalent decorative motif in the Maltese temple tradition, and the consistency of its appearance across all the major sites, across the full span of the thousand-year tradition, speaks to a symbolic vocabulary that was central to the community's way of marking and understanding its most significant spaces. Appearing on altar stones, on wall faces, on threshold stones, and on freestanding objects recovered from temple contexts. The spirals of the Maltese temples are among the most elaborate examples of this motif in prehistoric Europe, executed with a precision and a fluency that speaks to a well-established decorative tradition rather than experimental improvisation. They appear singly and in pairs, in interlocking chains, and in combinations with other geometric elements, including pitted surfaces, wavy lines, and chevron patterns. The meaning of the spiral in the Maltese temple context is not known. In other prehistoric European contexts, the spiral has been associated with the sun, with water, with fertility, and with various cosmological concepts, but the specific symbolic content that these associations carry varies widely from context to context, and applying any of them to Malta without independent evidence is speculative. What can be said is that the spiral was a form of considerable importance to the temple builders, invested with enough significance to be carved with great care on the most prominent surfaces of the most significant structures, and that its recurrence across 1,000 years of temple building speaks to its enduring centrality in the symbolic vocabulary of the tradition. The pitted decoration that appears on many Maltese Neolithic surfaces, created by pecking small depressions into the stone with a pointed tool, is another distinctive feature of the tradition. These pitted surfaces appear on altar stones and on floor surfaces in contexts that suggest they were not simply decorative but had specific ritual significance, perhaps related to the deposition of offerings or to the marking of specific locations within the temple as points of particular sacred attention. Among the most remarkable carved objects recovered from the Maltese temples is a stone screen or threshold piece from the Tarxian complex, decorated with spirals of extraordinary quality and scale. The main spiral frieze at Tarxian, which runs along the base of what was apparently a major altar, is one of the most accomplished examples of prehistoric stone carving known from this period, its spirals precise and confident, its execution reflecting a level of skill that was only achievable through long practice and deep knowledge of the material. The question of who made the decorated objects and carved the temple surfaces is one that the evidence cannot answer directly. The quality and consistency of the work across 1,000 years of tradition suggests that the knowledge required was transmitted systematically rather than rediscovered independently in each generation, and that there were specific individuals or groups within the community who held and passed on this technical knowledge. Whether they were full-time specialists or craftspeople who combined their work on the temples with other economic activities is not clear from the available evidence. The relationship between the Maltese temples and the natural environment of the islands is one of the more productive areas of recent research, and it has produced evidence for a connection between the temples and specific astronomical events that adds a new dimension to the understanding of their purpose. The alignment of several Maltese temples with the rising or setting sun at specific times of year has been documented carefully over the past several decades, and the evidence for deliberate astronomical orientation at the Najdra complex is now widely accepted among researchers who have examined the data. The precision of the alignment, which requires the temple to be positioned within a very small margin of error to achieve the specific solar effects at specific times of year, speaks to a community with both the astronomical knowledge to observe and predict these effects and the architectural knowledge to encode them in built structures. Has been documented by researchers working at the intersection of archaeology and archaeoastronomy. The Najdra temple complex, which sits on the southern coast of Malta overlooking the sea toward the island of Filfla, is the most well-documented case. At the spring and autumn equinoxes, the rising sun shines directly down the main axis of the temple, illuminating the interior in a way that is clearly not accidental. At the summer solstice, the sunrise illuminates a specific decorated stone on one side of the entrance, and at the winter solstice it illuminates the corresponding stone on the other side. These alignments, which require careful positioning of the temple during its construction to achieve the specific solar effects at specific times of year, speak to a community that was observing the movements of the sun with precision and incorporating those observations into the design of their most significant buildings. The practical value of knowing the precise dates of the solstices and equinoxes for an agricultural community, for timing the planting and harvesting of crops, makes it plausible that the astronomical knowledge encoded in the temple alignments had a practical dimension alongside whatever ritual or cosmological significance it carried. The orientation of other Maltese temples toward specific stars or toward the moon at specific phases has been proposed by various researchers, though these claims are more contested than the Najdra solar alignments and require more cautious evaluation. The basic finding, that the orientation of the temples was not random and that at least some temples were deliberately positioned to create specific relationships with astronomical phenomena, is now broadly accepted among researchers working on the site. The landscape setting of the temples also deserves attention in the context of their relationship with the natural world. Several temples are positioned on prominent ridges or coastal headlands with wide views of the surrounding landscape and the sea, and the visual relationship between the temple site and the horizon, where the sun rises and sets, would have been part of the experience of approaching and occupying the temple. The choice of these locations speaks to a community that understood the temples as part of a landscape rather than as isolated buildings, and that valued the specific relationships between built structure, natural terrain, and astronomical phenomena that their chosen sites made possible. The Hal Saflieni hypogeum is the most extraordinary structure in the Maltese prehistoric tradition, and one of the most remarkable prehistoric structures known. The hypogeum is a multi-level underground complex cut entirely from the bedrock of the soft Globigerina limestone, its surfaces worked with a care and a skill that places it among the most impressive prehistoric architectural achievements in the Mediterranean world. The specific combination of architectural elaborateness and underground setting gives the hypogeum a character that is unlike any other prehistoric structure. At once deeply enclosed and carefully designed, intimate and labyrinthine, a space that seems to have been intended to produce a specific kind of experience in the people who moved through it. Of the soft Globigerina limestone beneath what is now the residential Paola neighborhood of Valletta. It was excavated by human hands over an unknown period using antler picks and stone tools, its chambers and corridors following the natural lines of the rock while creating a complex spatial arrangement that covers approximately 500 square meters of floor space spread across 3 main levels, the uppermost of which is partly a natural cave enlarged by human work, and the 2 lower levels of which are entirely artificial. The middle level of the hypogeum is the most architecturally elaborate, its chambers carved with architectural details, false doorways framed by trilithon arrangements, corbelled niches that mimic the construction of above-ground architecture, and surfaces decorated with painted designs in red ochre. The main chamber of the middle level, a large rounded room whose corbelled ceiling reaches a height of several meters, is a space of considerable spatial power, its carved surfaces and its geometry combining to create an environment that is simultaneously cave-like in its enclosure and temple-like in its deliberate architectural treatment. The oracle room, a small chamber on the middle level, has acoustic properties that have attracted considerable research attention. A speaker standing in a specific position within the room and producing sounds at certain frequencies creates a resonance effect that is disproportionately powerful, the sound amplified and distributed through the adjacent chambers in ways that would have been perceptible to people throughout the upper levels of the complex. Whether this acoustic effect was discovered accidentally and then exploited, or whether the chamber was deliberately designed to achieve it, is not certain, but the effect is real and reproducible, and its presence in a chamber associated with the oracle function implied by its name is at minimum a remarkable coincidence. The hypogeum served primarily as a collective burial place, and the remains of several thousand individuals were found within it during the early excavations. The density of the deposit and the long period over which burials were made, spanning the full extent of the temple period, suggest that the hypogeum was a central repository for the community's dead, a place where the ancestors accumulated over the generations and where the relationship between the living community and its accumulated dead was maintained through ongoing ritual practice. The social organization of the Maltese temple builders is one of the central unsolved problems of prehistoric Mediterranean archaeology. The temples themselves imply organized collective labor at a scale that a small farming community could only have achieved through sustained cooperation across multiple generations. Moving the largest stones, some weighing tens of tons, from quarry to construction site without metal tools or wheeled transport required organizing the effort of many people working together, and the planning required to design and execute structures of the complexity of the Maltese temples presupposes the existence of specialized knowledge, of people who understood the architectural tradition in sufficient depth to direct its application in specific structures. Yet the settlement evidence associated with the temple tradition does not clearly show the kind of marked social stratification, the differentiation of housing quality, the concentration of wealth in specific households, that archaeologists typically look for as evidence of hierarchical political organization. The domestic sites of the Maltese Neolithic show a relatively uniform material culture, without the dramatic differentiation between rich and poor households that characterizes hierarchical societies. This absence of evidence for stratification in the settlement record is consistent with a community in which the authority required to organize temple construction was of a different kind from the hereditary political authority of a chief or a king, perhaps an authority grounded in ritual knowledge, in kinship obligation, or in the consensual recognition of specific individuals as custodians of the architectural and ceremonial tradition. The figurative evidence from the temples provides some indirect information about who held authority within the temple-using community. The large figurines associated with the temple contexts, some apparently fixed within the architectural fabric of the structure and others apparently portable, have been interpreted as representations of ritual specialists, of ancestors, or of deities, and their placement within the temples speaks to specific spatial associations between these figures and specific zones of the temple interior. The genetic evidence from the human remains found in the Maltese Neolithic contexts, which is beginning to be analyzed using ancient DNA techniques, is providing new information about the population of the islands, their relationships to each other and to populations elsewhere in the Mediterranean, and the patterns of movement that shaped the community over the course of the temple period. The emerging picture is of a relatively isolated island population with connections to the broader Neolithic Mediterranean world, but with a strong and specific local genetic identity that was maintained across many generations of the temple-building tradition. The question of how political authority was legitimized in the Maltese Neolithic community is one where the evidence points toward ritual and cosmological foundations rather than the hereditary political authority that later complex societies developed. The people who directed the temple-building program may have derived their authority primarily from their role as custodians of the ritual tradition rather than from inherited political status, and the temples themselves may have been as much a demonstration of that authority as an expression of it. The connections between Malta and the wider prehistoric Mediterranean world are visible in the material culture of the temple tradition, but limited in ways that suggest a community that was more isolated than most of its contemporaries. The presence of obsidian from the island of Pantelleria, which lies between Malta and Tunisia, in the Maltese Neolithic assemblages confirms that the island was in contact with the maritime exchange networks that connected the prehistoric Mediterranean communities. Pantelleria obsidian is found at sites across a wide area of the central Mediterranean, and its presence on Malta is consistent with the broader pattern of obsidian distribution that reflects the exchange relationships of the Neolithic Mediterranean. Beyond obsidian, the material evidence for long-distance exchange at Maltese Neolithic sites is relatively limited. The islands were not deeply integrated into the wider exchange networks of the prehistoric Mediterranean in the way that some contemporary communities were, and the relative scarcity of non-local materials in the Maltese archaeological assemblages reflects a community that was largely self-sufficient in its material culture and that maintained only selective connections to the world beyond the sea. The ceramics are largely locally produced, in forms and styles that are specific to the Maltese tradition, and that do not show the kind of widespread adoption of external styles that would indicate strong and sustained cultural influence from outside the islands. The figurine tradition is similarly local in character, with Maltese Neolithic figurines having a distinctive style that sets them apart from the figurine traditions of the surrounding Mediterranean regions. This relative cultural isolation is part of what makes the Maltese temple tradition so remarkable. The temples developed on the islands without the direct influence of any of the major prehistoric monument-building traditions of the wider Mediterranean or European world. The passage graves of Western Europe, the megalithic traditions of Brittany and the British Isles, the chamber tombs of the Iberian Peninsula, all of these traditions were developing in the same general period as the Maltese temples, but the specific architectural form of the Maltese temples, the trefoil plan with its sequence of apses, is not found anywhere else in the prehistoric world. It is a local invention, developed on these specific islands, by these specific communities, and carried to its fullest expression within the geographic boundaries of the Maltese archipelago. The question of why the Maltese tradition developed in the specific direction it did rather than in the directions taken by contemporary megalithic traditions elsewhere, is one that the available evidence cannot fully answer. The isolation of the island, which limited the pressure of external cultural influence, was probably an important factor. The specific geology of Malta, which provided a particularly workable stone in the Globigerina limestone, may have facilitated the development of an architectural tradition that exploited this material in specific ways. And the specific social and ritual needs of the Maltese Neolithic community, whatever they were, found expression in this particular architectural form rather than in the forms developed by communities with different social and environmental conditions. The central mystery of the Maltese temples is why they ended. The temple tradition lasted for approximately 1,000 years, from around 3,600 BCE to around 2,500 BCE, and then it stopped. Not gradually, not with a slow decline visible in a progressively simpler material culture. The evidence suggests a relatively abrupt end. The temples were apparently abandoned, and the population that had built and used them was replaced by a different population with a different material culture and, apparently, a different relationship to the monumental building tradition. The people who arrived in Malta around 2500 BCE, at the end of the temple period, are associated with a different ceramic tradition and with a different set of practices visible in the archaeological record. The smooth transition that one might expect if the temple tradition had simply evolved into something new is not what the evidence shows. What the evidence shows is more like a replacement, a new population with new practices arriving at a time when the temple-building community had, for whatever reason, ceased to function. What happened to the people who built the temples is a question that touches on the deepest uncertainties of prehistoric archaeology. The absence of written records means that the community that produced the temples left no account of itself, no narrative of its origins, its beliefs, or the circumstances of its end. What the archaeological evidence shows is the physical trace of what people did, not what they thought or felt, and the gap between the two is one that no amount of careful excavation can entirely bridge. That the archaeological evidence addresses only partially. One hypothesis proposes that the temple-building community suffered a catastrophic population decline, possibly related to environmental degradation, overpopulation relative to the carrying capacity of the small island, or epidemic disease, that reduced the population below the threshold required to maintain the tradition. Another hypothesis proposes that the temples were not abandoned because the population died, but because the social and ritual system that had given them their purpose underwent a transformation so fundamental that the physical infrastructure of the old tradition was no longer relevant to the new one. The environmental evidence offers some support for the degradation hypothesis. Analysis of the pollen preserved in Maltese lake sediments shows a significant reduction in tree cover during the temple period, consistent with deforestation for agricultural land and for the timber required in construction. The thin soils of the Maltese limestone plateau, under sustained agricultural pressure across many generations, may have become progressively less productive, and a community that had pushed its island environment to its limits may eventually have found that it could no longer sustain the population that the temple tradition required. The possible explanations for the end of the Maltese temple tradition are multiple, and none of them is fully supported by the available evidence. The environmental degradation hypothesis, which proposes that the temple-building community brought about its own decline through the overexploitation of the island's limited resources, is consistent with the pollen evidence for deforestation and with the general pattern of small island communities running into the ecological constraints of their limited territory. Island environments are particularly vulnerable to overexploitation because they lack the buffer of surrounding territory that continental communities can draw on when local resources become scarce. The Maltese community was confined to an island, and whatever pressure it placed on the soils and forests of that island accumulated without the possibility of relief from expansion into new territory. The population replacement hypothesis, which proposes that the temple builders were replaced by a new population arriving from elsewhere, is consistent with the abruptness of the cultural change visible in the archaeological record and with the evidence from ancient DNA analysis. which is beginning to show that the genetic profile of the Maltese population changed significantly around the time of the temple tradition's end. If a new population arrived in Malta around 2500 BCE, bringing with them a different ceramic tradition and different practices, the temple-using community that preceded them may have been reduced to a remnant, absorbed into the new population, or displaced entirely. A third possibility is that the end of the temple tradition was connected to changes in the social and ritual system, rather than to population change or environmental pressure. The beliefs and practices that sustained the tradition across 1,000 years may have lost their hold on the community in ways that the physical evidence cannot document, and the end of the tradition may have been, at its core, an end of faith rather than an end of population. Rather than to population change or environmental catastrophe. Social systems can collapse quickly when the beliefs and practices that sustain them lose their hold on the community, and the temple tradition, which appears to have been central to the social and ritual life of the Maltese Neolithic community, may have been more fragile than its physical remains would suggest. If the authority structures that organized the building and use of the temples were undermined by internal conflict, by the failure of the ritual system to deliver the outcomes it promised, or by the arrival of new ideas from outside the island, the tradition could have ended without any external catastrophe. What is not in doubt is that the end was real and that it was complete. The temples were not rebuilt or reused in ways that continued their original function. They stood empty, or were used for purposes unrelated to the original tradition, and the specific knowledge of how to build in the temple style was lost. A tradition that had lasted 1,000 years and produced some of the most remarkable structures in the prehistoric world came to an end, and its specific causes remain one of the more compelling unsolved problems in Mediterranean prehistoric archaeology. The Maltese temples belong to a broader family of megalithic traditions that were developing across Europe and the Mediterranean in the same period, and comparing them with their contemporaries illuminates both what they shared and what made them unique. The megalithic tradition of Western Europe, which produced the passage graves of Ireland, the stone circles of Britain, the alignments of Brittany, and the chamber tombs of the Iberian Peninsula, was developing in the same general period as the Maltese temples. These traditions share certain broad features: the use of large stones in deliberate architectural arrangements, the association of the monuments with burial and with ritual activities connected to the dead, and the investment of significant collective labor in the construction of structures that served primarily symbolic and ceremonial rather than practical purposes. But the specific architectural forms are very different from tradition to tradition, and the Maltese temple plan is found nowhere outside the Maltese archipelago. The passage graves of Ireland, including the well-known Newgrange monument in the Boyne Valley, offer an interesting comparison. Like the Maltese temples, Newgrange was designed to create a specific relationship between the built structure and the movement of the sun, with its famous roof box aligned to admit the midwinter sunrise into the central chamber. Like the Maltese temples, it was associated with the deposition of human remains and with ritual activities that connected the living community to its dead. But the architectural form, a circular mound covering a stone-lined passage leading to a central chamber, is quite different from the trefoil plan of the Maltese temples, and the two traditions developed independently in their respective geographic contexts. The comparison with the Neolithic stone circles of Britain, including Stonehenge, is one that is often made in popular accounts of the Maltese temples, because both traditions involve the use of large stones and both have solar alignments. But the architectural traditions are quite different, and the social and ritual contexts in which they developed were also different. Stonehenge was a monument that evolved over many centuries in a specific landscape context, drawing on architectural and social traditions specific to Britain. The Maltese temples were a product of island conditions, of the specific geology and the specific social circumstances of a small island community in the central Mediterranean. What the Maltese temple tradition shares with its contemporaries is the broader evidence that the impulse toward monumental construction, toward the investment of significant collective effort in structures whose purpose was primarily symbolic and ceremonial, was widespread across prehistoric Europe and the Mediterranean in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. The specific forms this impulse took varied enormously from place to place. But the impulse itself was widely distributed, and Malta is one of the places where it found its most distinctive and most durable expression. What makes the Maltese temples different from every other prehistoric monument tradition is the specific combination of features that they present, and the challenge that combination poses to our understanding of what small farming communities were capable of achieving. The temples are freestanding stone structures, not earthworks or stone arrangements, built with a level of architectural sophistication that includes planned spatial sequences, carved decoration, astronomical alignments, and acoustic design. They were built by a small island community without metal tools, without wheeled transport, and without draft animals. They represent the work of many generations, maintained and elaborated across a 1,000-year tradition that did not simply repeat an original design, but continued to develop and refine its forms across the entire span of the tradition. No other prehistoric monument tradition combines all of these features in quite the same way. The megalithic traditions of Western Europe produced large stone structures, but not with the same degree of internal spatial complexity. The temples of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia involved sophisticated planning and construction, but they were produced by state-level societies with the full institutional apparatus of centralized civilization. The Maltese temples were produced by a community that was, by any conventional measure, far less organizationally complex than the societies that built the pyramids or the great temples of the ancient Near East. The Maltese case is therefore important not as a curiosity or an anomaly, but as evidence that the relationship between social complexity and architectural achievement is not as straightforward as the standard accounts suggest. The temples were built by people who were not, by any conventional measure, a complex society. They were farmers and herders on a small island, without a state, without writing, without metal, without any of the organizational technologies that the standard accounts treat as necessary conditions for monumental construction. And yet they built these structures, maintained this tradition for 1,000 years, and left behind evidence that still commands attention after 5,000 years of exposure to the Mediterranean elements. The specific technical knowledge required to design and execute the Maltese temples was real and was sophisticated. It was accumulated across generations and transmitted within the community through mechanisms that preserved it across a very long period. But it was accumulated and transmitted within a relatively simple social context, without the apparatus of state administration, professional specialization in the modern sense, or hereditary political authority. The temples of Malta are evidence that humans can organize significant technical and artistic achievement through community mechanisms that do not require hierarchy, literacy, or the institutional forms that later complex societies developed to organize their own building programs. They are evidence of a different kind of organizational intelligence, one that operated through tradition, through collective commitment to a shared symbolic project, and through the specific social dynamics of a small, isolated island community over many generations. The experience of visiting the Maltese temples is unlike the experience of visiting any other ancient monument in the world. The temples are still standing, many of them substantially intact, their stone walls still rising several meters above the surrounding landscape, their interior spaces still accessible and still preserving the spatial logic of the original design. Walking through the entrance of one of the major temples and moving through the sequence of outer and inner apses is an experience that the architecture makes available to the modern visitor in a relatively direct way. The specific spatial progression that the builders created, from the open forecourt to the enclosed inner apse, is still experienceable because the architecture that created it is still there. The carved decoration of the temples, where it survives, adds another dimension to the experience. The spirals and pitted surfaces of the Tarxian complex, the decorated altar stones, the carved threshold pieces. These are surfaces that were worked by human hands 5,000 years ago, and the quality of the carving, its precision and its confidence, communicates across the millennia in a way that does not require translation or interpretation. The skill is visible. The care that went into the work is visible. And the specific abstract language of the spiral and the pitted surface, whatever it meant to the people who made it, has a visual authority that is independent of its specific meaning. The scale of the largest temples and the scale of the individual stones used in their construction is a physical fact that is easier to appreciate in person than in photographs. The outer walls of Giza on Gozo, still standing to a height of 6 meters and built from limestone blocks that required many people working together to put in place, are simply impressive as physical objects, quite apart from any historical or archaeological significance. They are evidence of capability, of the sustained application of physical effort and technical knowledge to a specific project, and that evidence speaks directly to the visitor in a way that does not require any scholarly framework to appreciate. The setting of the temples in the Maltese landscape adds another layer of meaning. Several of the major temple complexes are positioned on ridges with wide views of the surrounding landscape and the sea, and the relationship between the temple, the land, and the horizon that these positions create is part of what the builders intended. Looking out from the entrance of Najdra toward the island of Filfla on the southern horizon, or from the Giza complex across the fields of Gozo toward the sea, one is seeing something of what the builders saw, and the specificity of the view, the sense of a particular community in a particular place looking out at a particular landscape, is part of what makes the temples so compelling. The practical experience of visiting the temples in different seasons and at different times of day reveals dimensions of their design that photographs and plans cannot capture. The way the light moves through the apses changes across the course of the day. The acoustic qualities of the enclosed chambers become more apparent when spoken words are tested against the stone surfaces. The scale of the individual orthostats, which seems abstract on paper, becomes physically present when standing next to them. The temples were designed to be experienced, and experiencing them remains the most direct way of understanding what the builders achieved. The decline and eventual abandonment of the temple tradition was followed by a long period in which Malta was occupied by communities whose relationship to the physical remains of the earlier civilization was complex and varied. The Bronze Age communities that occupied Malta after the end of the temple tradition did not build temples in the same style. Their material culture was different, their burial practices were different, and their relationship to the monumental structures that their predecessors had left in the landscape was one of occupation rather than continuation. Some temple sites show evidence of Bronze Age reuse, of people living in or near the ancient structures, using the ready-worked stone of the temples as a convenient building material for their own more modest constructions. This reuse, which involved the removal of stone from the temple walls and the disturbance of the deposits within the temples, was responsible for some of the damage that has complicated the modern archaeological understanding of the sites. The long sequence of later occupation on Malta, through the Phoenician, Carthaginian, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Norman, and other periods, involved the continuous use and reuse of the limited land area of the island in ways that affected the preservation of the prehistoric remains at the surface. Sites that were not covered by later construction were exposed to the elements, and the relatively soft Globigerina limestone of the interior surfaces weathered badly over the millennia. Some sites were built over so completely that they were effectively invisible until chance discoveries during construction work, like the discovery of the hypogeum in 1902, brought them to light. The modern preservation of the Maltese temples reflects the collective judgment of the international heritage community that these structures represent a form of human achievement significant enough to justify sustained investment in their protection and presentation. That judgment is supported by everything the archaeology has revealed about the tradition: its age, its technical sophistication, its duration, and the evidence it provides for the range of what small, relatively isolated communities were capable of achieving in the prehistoric world. That these structures are of sufficient significance to justify the investment of resources in their protection and presentation. Malta joined UNESCO as a signatory to the World Heritage Convention in 1978, and 5 prehistoric sites, Giza, the Hypogeum, and the 3 temple complexes of Hagar Kim, Najdra, and Tarxian, were inscribed on the World Heritage List in 1980, with additional sites added subsequently. The protective tent structures that now cover Hagar Kim and Najdra, installed in 2009 to protect the carved surfaces from acid rain and UV radiation, are one of the most visible expressions of the commitment to preserving these structures for future generations. The challenge of preserving the temples against the specific threats of the Mediterranean environment, including the salt spray from the nearby sea, the fluctuating temperatures and humidity levels that stress the stone, and the biological growth that covers surfaces left exposed to the weather, is an ongoing conservation effort that involves Maltese government agencies, international heritage organizations, and a team of conservation specialists who monitor the condition of the structures and intervene when necessary. What modern archaeology has learned about the Maltese temples in the past several decades has significantly transformed the understanding of the tradition and of the community that produced it. The application of radiocarbon dating to organic materials from temple contexts has been one of the most productive methodological developments in Maltese prehistoric research, providing a chronological framework for the tradition that earlier researchers could only approximate through the analysis of ceramic sequences and architectural typology. The precision of this framework has continued to improve as more samples have been dated and as the statistical methods for analyzing the resulting chronologies have been refined. Has established a chronological framework for the tradition that was not available to earlier researchers, and the precision of this framework has improved as the number of dated samples has grown and as the calibration of the radiocarbon timescale has been refined. The current understanding of the temple sequence places the beginning of the tradition around 3600 BCE and its end around 2500 BCE, a span of roughly 1,000 years that encompasses several distinct phases of architectural and ceramic development. The environmental reconstruction of the Maltese Neolithic landscape, using pollen analysis from lake sediments and other paleo-environmental methods, has provided evidence for the ecological context in which the temples were built and the environmental changes that accompanied the tradition's development. The evidence for progressive deforestation across the temple period, and for the associated changes in soil conditions that would have affected agricultural productivity, has added an environmental dimension to the understanding of the tradition's rise and decline that purely archaeological approaches could not have provided. The study of the human remains from the Maltese Neolithic contexts, using techniques ranging from conventional osteological analysis to stable isotope analysis and ancient DNA sequencing, is providing increasingly detailed information about the population of the islands, their diet, their health, their movement patterns, and their genetic relationships. The isotopic evidence for diet confirms the mixed agricultural, pastoral, and marine economy suggested by the botanical and faunal remains. The ancient DNA evidence, still emerging as samples from Maltese contexts are analyzed, is beginning to address the question of population continuity or replacement at the end of the temple period in ways that earlier research could not. The architectural survey of the temples, using three-dimensional laser scanning and photogrammetric documentation, has produced records of the structures at a level of detail that was not achievable with earlier documentation methods. These records serve both a scientific purpose, allowing detailed analysis of construction techniques, alignment, and spatial organization, and a conservation purpose, providing a baseline against which future changes in the condition of the structures can be measured. What remains uncertain about the Maltese temples encompasses some of the most fundamental questions that the tradition raises. The purpose of the temples is the most basic uncertainty, and it is one that the very richness of the evidence makes more rather than less difficult to resolve. The temples were clearly important, clearly the focus of significant collective investment, clearly associated with specific activities and specific objects. But the step from what was done in the temples to what it meant to the people who did it is a step that the material evidence alone cannot take. The term temple implies a religious or ritual function, and the evidence from the sites, the elaborate architectural settings, the deposits of bones and organic material, the figurines and the decorated surfaces, is broadly consistent with ritual use. But the specific nature of the rituals performed within the temples, the beliefs that those rituals expressed, and the social functions they served within the Maltese Neolithic community, are questions that the material evidence cannot directly answer. The identity of the people who held authority within the temple-using community is another area of genuine uncertainty. The absence of clear evidence for a ruling elite in the domestic contexts does not mean that authority was absent, but it does mean that whatever authority existed did not express itself in the material markers that archaeologists typically look for. The specific social mechanisms through which the temple tradition was organized, transmitted, and sustained across 1,000 years are invisible in the archaeological record in the way that most social processes are invisible. They leave traces only when they fail or when they produce durable physical artifacts, and the specific processes that sustained the Maltese temple tradition left relatively few such traces. The cause or causes of the end of the temple tradition remain genuinely open. The environmental, demographic, and social hypotheses all have some evidence in their favor, but none of them can account for the full pattern of what the evidence shows, including the apparent abruptness of the cultural change and the evidence for population replacement that the ancient DNA analysis is beginning to suggest. The end of the Maltese temple tradition is one of those moments in prehistoric archaeology where the evidence raises a clear question. When and why did a specific cultural tradition that had persisted for 1,000 years come to an end, but does not provide a clear answer? The connections between the Maltese temple tradition and the wider prehistoric Mediterranean world, and particularly the question of whether the temple tradition influenced or was influenced by contemporary monument-building traditions elsewhere, is another area where the evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The relative cultural isolation of the islands makes strong external influence unlikely, but the maritime connections implied by the obsidian evidence and by the broader pattern of Mediterranean Neolithic exchange mean that the temple builders were not entirely cut off from the developments occurring elsewhere. The Maltese temples change how we think about the relationship between community scale and cultural achievement in the prehistoric world. The standard accounts of prehistoric cultural development tend to place significant architectural and artistic achievement in the context of increasing social complexity, treating complexity as a precondition for the kind of sustained, organized work that the temples represent. The Maltese evidence complicates this picture in a specific and productive way. In the context of increasingly complex social organization, treating social complexity as a precondition for the kind of sustained, organized, technically sophisticated work that the temples represent. On this account, the temples of Malta should not exist, because the community that built them was not complex enough, by the standard measures of social complexity, to have produced them. The temples exist nonetheless, and the challenge they present to the standard account is not simply an empirical anomaly to be noted and set aside. It is evidence that the standard account is incomplete in an important way. The capacity for organized, ambitious, technically sophisticated collective action is not confined to societies above a certain threshold of organizational complexity. It is more widely distributed, and it can be expressed through social mechanisms that do not require the institutional apparatus of a state or the hereditary authority of a chief. The specific mechanisms through which the Maltese community organized its temple-building tradition remain uncertain, but the tradition itself is evidence that those mechanisms were effective and that they were sustainable across many generations. Whatever social technology the temple builders used to coordinate their efforts, to transmit their architectural knowledge, and to maintain the collective commitment to the temple project across 1,000 years of building, it worked. The temples are the proof. The broader implication is that the range of social technologies available to human communities for organizing collective action is wider than the historical record of literate civilizations suggests. Literacy, bureaucracy, and hereditary political authority are all effective technologies for organizing large-scale collective action, and they have left a disproportionate trace in the historical record because they produced the written documents and the visible political structures that historians have typically focused on. But they are not the only technologies, and the prehistoric communities of Malta, Cahokia, and Catalhoyuk are among the evidence that other technologies existed and could achieve outcomes comparable in ambition to those produced by the better documented mechanisms of complex civilization. The Maltese case also raises questions about the role of isolation in cultural innovation. The relative separation of the islands from the mainland world, combined with the specific ecological conditions of island existence, may have created the conditions in which a specific tradition could develop and persist without the external pressures that would have disrupted or transformed it in a more connected environment. Island communities, cut off from the constant flow of external influence that characterizes mainland cultural development, sometimes develop highly distinctive traditions that reflect the specific local conditions of their particular place. The Maltese temple tradition is one of the most striking examples of this pattern in the prehistoric world. The people who built the Maltese temples were fully human in every sense that matters, and the evidence they left behind speaks of lives and concerns that connect across 5,000 years. The figurines recovered from the temple contexts are the most direct evidence for the human bodies and the human preoccupations of the temple builders, and they are objects that repay close attention. The quality of the best examples, their smooth surfaces, their carefully considered proportions, the specific postures and conditions they depict, speaks of makers who were working within a developed aesthetic tradition rather than simply making objects whose form was determined by practical function. For the human bodies and the human preoccupations of the temple builders. The large, carefully made figures associated with the major temple contexts, some showing sleeping or resting forms, others showing seated figures with the distinctive round-bodied proportions of the Maltese Neolithic tradition, speak of a community that was thinking about the human body, about rest and transformation, about the relationship between the living and the dead, in ways that produced specific material expressions. These figures were not casual objects. The quality of their execution and the care of their placement within the temple contexts speak to objects of significance, invested with attention and intention by the people who made and used them. The human remains from the hypogeum, representing several thousand individuals deposited over many generations, are the most direct physical evidence of the people who made up the Maltese Neolithic community. Bioarchaeological analysis of these remains has shown a population that was living on a mixed diet of plant and animal foods, that was performing the physically demanding labor of agriculture and construction, and that was experiencing the health challenges typical of a small island community dependent on a limited range of food resources. The bones carry the evidence of specific lives, the wear of repeated physical effort, the marks of healed injuries, the signs of specific diseases. These were real people with real bodies who did real work and left real traces. The spiral carved on the threshold stone of Tarxian, the ochre stain on the wall of the hypogeum, the sleeping figure from the underground chamber. These are objects that the hands of specific people made, and the making of them required the same combination of skill, intention, and physical effort that the making of any significant object in any period requires. The 5,000 years of distance between the makers and the modern visitor who stands in front of these objects does not eliminate the humanity of the exchange. The objects speak of people who were paying attention, who cared about specific things, who invested their skill and their time in specific expressions of what mattered to them. That this evidence survives, in the compressed earth of the temple floors and in the preserved stone of the temple walls, is partly a matter of the durability of stone and partly a matter of the specific conditions of Maltese preservation. But it is also partly a matter of the care and the deliberateness with which the temple builders worked, the quality of construction that has allowed these structures to stand for 5,000 years, the depth of carving that has allowed the spirals to survive the weathering of millennia. The temples endure because they were built to endure, and the community that built them knew, in some sense, what they were making. The central image of the Maltese temples is the image of stone rising from the Mediterranean landscape, built by human hands before history was written. The approach to Giza on Gozo begins as a walk through a modern Maltese village, past stone houses and gardens. Then the ancient walls appear above the surrounding field walls, and the scale of the structure becomes apparent in a way that changes the character of the visit. The 6-meter outer wall of coralline limestone, its surface slightly rough, its courses of stone fitted without mortar, extends along the approach path in a way that forces a physical reckoning with what it means to say that this structure was built 5,000 years ago by a farming community on a small island without metal tools. Past stone houses and small gardens, before the ancient walls appear above the surrounding field walls. The outer wall of the South Temple, built from enormous blocks of coralline limestone fitted together without mortar, rises 6 meters above the ground and extends for 100 meters along the south and east sides of the complex. It is one of the best preserved prehistoric walls in the world, and its scale, in the context of a modest rural landscape, has the quality of an encounter with something that was not expected. The wall is simply there, solid and patient, in a way that makes the question of who built it and why feel immediately and personally pressing. Inside the complex, the sequence of apses unfolds as the builders intended. The outer chambers larger and more public, the inner chambers smaller and more intimate, the carved decoration concentrated on the surfaces that mattered most. The spirals of the decorated altar stone in the South Temple are visible at close range, their curves precise and confident, their surfaces slightly softened by 5,000 years of exposure but still clear enough to read as intentional marks made by skilled hands. The apses frame views of the sky, and the light that moves through the complex during the course of a day changes the character of the spaces in ways that suggest the builders understood and used the properties of natural light. The sea is visible from the ridge on which Giza stands, the blue of the Mediterranean extending south and east toward the invisible horizon of Africa. 5,000 years ago, the people who built these walls saw the same sea from this same ridge. They came here to build something that they understood as important, using knowledge transmitted to them by their parents and grandparents, adding their own contribution to a tradition that had been going on for longer than anyone could remember. They lifted these stones with ropes and levers and the organized effort of many people working together, fitted them into walls that have stood for 5 millennia, and carved their symbolic language into the surfaces of the most prominent stones. Whatever they believed it with the commitment visible in the work they left behind. The stones are the evidence. They are still here. The Maltese temples are recognized internationally as among the most significant prehistoric monuments in the world, and their management as heritage sites reflects the complexity of preserving ancient structures in a modern Mediterranean island context. Malta has been an independent nation since 1964, and the management of its prehistoric heritage within that national context has involved choices about how to balance the demands of preservation, research, public access, and economic development that are not always easy to reconcile. The temples are among the most visited sites in Malta, and the revenue from cultural tourism that they generate is significant for an island economy that has always depended heavily on attracting visitors. And the management of its remarkable prehistoric heritage has been a national responsibility and a point of national pride throughout that period. Heritage Malta, the national agency responsible for the management of the country's museums and cultural heritage sites, oversees the preservation and presentation of the major prehistoric sites and the investment in visitor infrastructure, conservation programs, and archaeological research at the major temple complexes reflects the priority that the Maltese government places on the management of this heritage. The visitor experience at the major sites varies considerably. Giza on Gozo, one of the oldest and most imposing of the complexes, is presented within a purpose-built visitor center that provides context for the site before visitors approach the temples themselves. Hagar Kim and Najdra on the southern coast of Malta are now protected by the large tent structures installed in 2009, which have significantly changed the visual character of the sites, but have also demonstrably slowed the rate of surface deterioration on the carved limestone. The hypogeum is managed with strict visitor number controls, accepting only small groups at a time, because the accumulation of moisture and carbon dioxide from visitor breath was found to be damaging the painted surfaces of the interior. The management of the sites as living heritage, connected to the communities that live around them, is an ongoing dimension of the work. The residents of Zagra on Gozo, the village adjacent to Giza, have a particular relationship to the ancient structure that is part of their immediate landscape, and the integration of local community knowledge and local community engagement into the management of the site is a dimension of heritage practice that has grown in importance over the decades. The international research community that works at the Maltese temples brings perspectives and methods from across the world to a body of evidence that continues to reward analysis. The questions that the temples raise about the social organization of small farming communities, about the relationship between ritual and architecture, about the ends and beginnings of specific cultural traditions, are questions of broad human relevance that connect the specific evidence from Malta to the broader enterprise of understanding what human communities have been capable of across the full range of their history. The Mediterranean is quiet at dawn on the southern coast of Malta. The sea below Najdra moves without urgency in the early morning, the long Mediterranean swells coming in slow against the pale limestone shore. The air is cool and carries the salt of the open sea. The light is still horizontal, moving across the stone surfaces at an angle that makes every carved detail sharp and precise. The swells of the open Mediterranean coming in long and slow against the limestone shore. The island of Filfla sits on the horizon, a dark shape against the brightening sky. The temples of Najdra stand on the ridge above the sea, their outer walls pale in the early light, their chambers still in shadow. At the spring equinox, the sun rises directly in line with the main axis of the central temple, and its light travels down the corridor from the entrance to the back wall in a way that the builders arranged 5,000 years ago, by positioning the structure precisely on this ridge with this orientation toward this horizon. The people who first observed this effect, who understood the relationship between the temple's orientation and the movement of the sun, who built and rebuilt and refined the structure until the equinox sunrise fell exactly as intended, were doing something that required sustained observation, accumulated knowledge, and organized collective action across many generations. They were connecting the built world to the natural world in a specific and deliberate way, marking the turning points of the year in stone and light. That connection is still there. The equinox sunrise still enters the temple. The carved spirals still mark the surfaces of the stones. The walls still stand. Whatever was understood here, whatever relationship between the human community and the larger patterns of the natural world was encoded in the alignment of these chambers with the movement of the sun, it was understood well enough to build it into stone structures that have lasted 5,000 years. The island of temples older than Egypt is small, rocky, and warm. The light on the limestone in the afternoon has a quality that is specific to the Mediterranean, warm and direct, making the colors of the stone shift from pale cream to gold as the sun moves. The carved surfaces of the temples catch this light differently at different times of day, and the builders understood this, positioned their structures and oriented their decorated surfaces to be seen in the specific quality of light available on this specific island. Its prehistoric monuments are among the most extraordinary that the ancient world produced, and they are here, on this ridge above the Mediterranean, available to be visited and studied and sat with in the early morning light. The tradition that produced them began here, lasted 1,000 years, and ended here, for reasons that are still being worked out. What it left behind is the evidence that it existed, in the form of the buildings themselves, patient and specific, still oriented toward the sky. If this documentary kept you company through the night, there is more waiting for you. Choose the next film on screen, and let the story keep unfolding.